This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast. I'm Therese Fessenden. As AI rapidly evolves, the policy around AI, to put it kindly, lags a bit. Policy and legislation often take years to both draft, review, revise, and approve. But the dialogue around AI policy has been much louder and much more public than that of technologies before, which can make it a bit dizzying and overwhelming to follow. But luckily, there are some folks who are passionate about following AI policy and, even better, passionate about sharing that knowledge and analysis with others. Today, I'm featuring a chat with AI ethicist Paige Lord, a former coworker of mine who now works at GitHub as a senior product marketing manager in AI. Paige holds a master's in international law from Harvard, with her thesis focusing on AI and privacy rights, which she'll share a little bit more about that in a little bit. But in this episode, we chat about the important role that even the most junior UX designers and researchers have in creating responsible AI products and services. Let's jump in. So, Paige, thank you for being here today, for joining us on the show. Listeners may not know this, but Paige and I used to work at Microsoft together, and now Paige has gone on to this really interesting role at GitHub, which technically falls under the Microsoft banner. But Paige, I would love to catch up, have some of our listeners get to know you a bit and share a little bit of your journey. Like, how did you get to AI at GitHub?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, Therese. Thanks for having me. And yeah, we did start together back in 2013, so it feels like forever ago that we met in Georgia. How did I get here? What a question. So I started at Microsoft again in 2013 as a college hire, was in the world of consulting for a little while, and then moved into program management, which I was in for a long time, and did a lot of managing of technical communities at Microsoft, and then eventually moved into the world of data and artificial intelligence, and specifically in our consulting wing of Microsoft. And then I moved into the sales and marketing side of data and artificial intelligence. So got a lot closer to the product and understanding why we were building the products we were building and how we were taking those products to market. And then after almost 10 years at Microsoft, I had been doing program management for so long that I was like, I need to do something a little different. So I moved over into GitHub, and then I moved into product marketing, and I've been in product marketing for a while now. And then on the side, while I've been at Microsoft, I've been doing a ton of work related to responsible AI, AI ethics, and AI policy. So I've been doing that kind of on the side, and I'm now at a point in my career where those things are beginning to kind of intertwine, which is really cool.
Like, what inspired you to go down that path? Because it sounds like that was something you kind of started independently of your role, and then it just happened to work out that now these two things are coming together. Was there something that sort of sparked that curiosity in you that made you think, this is what I want to study, this is what I'm into?
Yeah, I was on a work trip in India, in Hyderabad, India, and I was in this cab with my colleagues, and they were having a conversation about the data that's collected and used to train facial recognition technology. And I remember being so shocked by the way the data was collected from social media. People were posting their photos on social media, and then these companies were sort of crawling social media, grabbing these photos. And of course, because you're posting photos of yourself online, they could grab your face and easily relate it to who you are. So they had all the information they need to be able to not only identify your face and your person, but others as well. And so they were using that data to train their facial recognition models. And I remember thinking that felt really dangerous and unfair to people, that they would use their social media for things like connectedness, and that what they put out there all of a sudden becomes the thing that trains these models, some of which were used for in things like policing. So I remember being really shocked by that and thinking that somebody should really do something about this, and started looking into people who were researching this and studying this, people who were building the facial recognition technology. And I went back to school in 2018 is when I started taking classes, graduated in 2020 with my master's degree, where I focused on the use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement and the ways in which it might infringe on privacy and due process rights. So that story is really what got me into asking these bigger questions about what's going on in this world.
So first of all, I guess I wanted to say that if there are any listeners who do want to learn more about like AI policy, you have an amazing Substack. And that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you, because I've been following your Substack for a while and really just appreciating the summaries, the analyses that you do to a lot of AI current events, basically, or changes in global AI policy. So for one, I just needed to plug that early. But secondly, I wanted to pick your brain about, is there something that's particularly top of mind in the world of AI policy that we should be thinking about or considering?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much. It's very kind of you. I created the newsletter because there was so much happening in the world of responsible AI and AI policy. Some things that are related to responsible AI that aren't necessarily related to policy, and it felt really important to me that people have a good understanding of what's happening. So I put this newsletter together, and lately, one of the big things that's been on people's mind is just the topic of AI policy in general, because we've got the EU AI Act just passed, and so we're starting to see that come into force. We've got the AI executive order, which was signed by President Biden, but of course, with depending on who gets elected, that could change, and so there's just a lot of uncertainty right now. So what you have is, because we're not seeing policy happening kind of at the congressional level, federal level, you're seeing it happen across states, which is making it more and more complicated for AI companies to be able to produce AI that meets the needs of every single state or meets the laws of every single state. But then you're getting people who are getting kind of unequal protections because one state will protect one group of people or one type of use of AI and another state won't. And so it's becoming more and more complicated. So I would say AI policy as a topic is just in general number one. Another thing is the use of artificial intelligence, specifically generative AI in the election right now is a humongous topic, so much so that I had to dedicate an entire section to it, like a regularly occurring section in my newsletter, because there are so many updates and people talking about what does misuse look like in the context of a U.S. presidential election. And other topics include things like one that I wrote about recently was dynamic pricing by Kroger and other companies that are, grocery stores that are using dynamic pricing to change the prices of food based on the time of day or the time of year or how in demand that product is. So it's creating an unnecessary burden on families who, if they could end up paying higher prices just because they got off a shift and they had to go to the grocery store at that hour, that was their only time that was available to them. So there's a lot happening right now in the world of AI and AI policy, and not a lot of clarity, unfortunately. So,
yeah, I think that's a really thought-provoking point, and one that I'm glad that you said, because yes, like user experience research and design, like the whole point of what we do is to get at the heart of what people need, right? Whoever our user might be, whether that's an employee, whether that's an end customer or a client or something, we are advocating for their needs to get met. And often I think it's easy as a junior designer or researcher to kind of zero in on maybe a specific job to be done. Like if we're often given a project, we're probably given this very narrow scope saying this is a job to be done. We're going to create a feature. We're going to create a screen to address this particular job to be done, or a series of screens. And that becomes the entire focus of our work. But to your point, there's a responsibility there to think about, okay, yes, this is a job to be done. And yes, this is a series of screens. But what does that series of screens ultimately lead to? What's the end outcome? And am I thinking of the context in which my experience currently lives, right? So thinking about, in the case of groceries, right? Am I going to be meeting some of the primary needs and concerns of my audience, which for many, the number one concern for a lot of these families is, can I get groceries quickly, easily, and affordably? There are going to be some of these overarching needs that are going to transcend any job to be done. And so if we're kind of violating some of these deeper values, then certainly that's going to hurt a lot of people, both emotionally and, maybe even in a longer, toward their longer term interests as well. So, yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And I understand. I do sympathize with the pressure that comes from, especially if you're working for a company or you have a customer or a client that's saying, I'm not paying you to tell me how to do this responsibly. I'm paying you to do this. We were both in consulting. We know we've sat with those customers.
Yeah, laugh, cry.
Yep. Yeah, the laugh, cry. Exactly. And I'm not saying that I think everybody gets to a point where they kind of work through wherever they're at in their role and how much voice and power they have. Mm-hmm. So if somebody is in a situation where they're like, I'm going to risk my whole job to like make this stance, there are some times I think where we have to disagree and commit on certain things that are maybe lower risk scenarios than higher risk scenarios. And like I said, it's impossible to speak to those without knowing the exact specifics. But I think everybody, if you take a measured approach to understanding just the broader context of what are we building and how are we putting it out there, even coming down to the messaging. I work with messaging all day long at GitHub and am constantly asking questions. Does this messaging tell the actual true story? Is this transparent? Is it clear? And those questions really matter. And so you'll move, I think, from being in a position where you're asking the questions to being maybe as you're later in career in a position of power where you can ask those questions and change that narrative. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point too that you brought up a little bit earlier that I really want to zero in on is working closely with policy teams. Mm-hmm. And I know for me, when I started my career, I had no idea who policy, like if you asked me back then, have you talked to your policy team lately? I'd be like, who? What am I supposed to talk to them about? And I think being able to frame your conversation with these folks as, hey, I want to learn more about what you do, that's probably going to be a really great first start. Because I know for me, I had no idea what these teams did. And secondly, the other route that you could definitely take this as a designer is like a common activity that I would do is like UX workshops where I would either ideate or I would do some research analysis with the researchers who gathered the data in order for me to come up with my own visual prototype or with my own wireframes. And it's funny when I think about how long I went in my career before I ever thought, hey, maybe we should invite compliance folks to come to these workshops, because it certainly wasn't something I considered until later in my career when I started realizing that there are certain things like certain laws, certain regulations, certain even company policies that dictate the way that we do a design or dictate the decisions we decide to take. And for years, I sort of took these, oh, that's the policy, like that's the stamp, that's what it says I must do, therefore that's the thing I will do. And I rarely took an inquisitive lens to say, hey, this is an opportunity to talk about it. Like this is a prompt. This is like a discussion starting point rather than a discussion ender. So I think being able to frame our capabilities in a slightly different way, like, yeah, sure, maybe that's not something we're responsible for. Maybe that's not something we can change. But what we can do is learn from some of the subject matter experts in these compliance and policy teams who can bring to the table both a little bit of foresight into what could be happening in the future, as well as here's what you can and can't do, and maybe the rationale behind the policies that do exist.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think are important to know about policy teams, because I think people can get intimidated as well talking with them. It's like talking with legal. Like if legal says it, you're just like, that's what legal said. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is that most people don't go into the world of policy because they're hoping to like get a big paycheck. Most people go into the world of policy because they want to make a difference on a huge scale. And policy is one of the ways to do that. So I think that you'll find that when you dig deeper into the conversations and stories of the people who are actually like either creating company policy or who are working to influence, broader policy globally or domestically, you'll find that they have a deeper story, a deeper motivation. The second thing is that what I've found is that people who work in policy love to talk about policy. They are known as policy nerds. I didn't come up with this term. It's just out there in the world. So I think that you'll find that they love to talk about what the policy is about. And then the third thing is that policy takes such a huge amount of work because it is such a complicated process. So people in policy spend years trying to get an understanding of how the actual stuff works, how it works from getting something even written to getting something voted on to getting something passed. Like it's a series of, I think in US politics, it feels like a series of miracles to get something that actually like is voted on and passed. And so I think that people in the world of policy, would be interested in having a conversation about what that looks like and how complicated that is, and giving people insight into, where things stand right now, which is why when we talk about, you asked the question about, what's top of people's mind right now with policy, it's just policy right now because we don't really have a lot to hang our hat on. And it's because it's complicated. So all of this to say, I think, getting to know your people in your policy team, and not as like I need all of the answers right now, but sort of as, let me just explore this a little more to get an understanding for where the areas of concern are, because then maybe you in your job can be looking out for these areas of concern as you work with clients or as you design something, and you can be thinking about some of the pain points that policy people in policy are working to address.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful and healthy way to approach it, especially if you're newer to policy, for sure. So I guess the follow-up question around that is, at least from my experience in the public sector, like one thing I remember is how painful the bureaucracy of policy change can be. Like sometimes these can be such sluggish processes that often get outpaced by like technological developments. And so I'm curious though, like obviously AI has a lot of hype around the latest and greatest developments. And I want to know your perspective. Like, do you think this pace, rather being outpaced by technology, is that representative of AI policy, or is AI policy a bit different compared to, say, other things that you may have studied?
I think it feels just as slow to me. So I don't think that this is a lot faster. I will say that states seem to be on their game a little more than what we might have seen in the past with other policies, sort of at the dawn of the digital age and the computing age. We're having a lot of conversation about this right now, in part because information about artificial intelligence is so accessible, and artificial intelligence is so accessible. So it's automatically, now it's in people's homes, it's on people's computers. People are able to produce images or create content or create audio or what have you, and be able to put that out and then have conversations about it on the internet. So we're just in kind of a different place right now. I don't think that the policy is moving faster, but I think that the conversations are maybe louder. Because people have more of a voice through social media, and they're sharing their insights and their perspectives and commenting and liking and asking questions and sharing their viewpoints. So I don't think we're going to see major like federal AI policy by the end of this year. But I think we will see an increasing AI policy in the states. And there's a huge bill that's up for vote actually today, August 20th, in the state of California, which would impose some pretty serious restrictions on any company that is building or using artificial intelligence in the state of California. So there's just a lot happening right now, but I would say it's still sluggish.
Yeah. So I guess on that note, for that law that's about to get passed in California, what are some things that designers of AI tools, what do they need to be mindful of should that pass?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this bill that's being voted on in California, we don't know if it's going to pass. There is a lot of opposition to this bill, and there's also a lot of support for this bill. It's called SB 1047, and it's the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Models Act. And there are a number of concerns about this act. The goal of the act is to ensure that safety is considered from the beginning of the production of an AI model before it goes out to the people, which I think in theory is a really, thoughtful approach to artificial intelligence. Some of the concerns that people have are around one particular part of the bill, which is known as the pre-enforcement portion of the bill. And that's where they this bill would require not just the company that's building the AI model, but the individual developer that's building the model to write up a safety document that outlines any of the safety concerns that there might be with this particular model. The challenge with it is that they would be writing up this safety document before the model is released. And then if something were to happen that resulted in some kind of a catastrophe where there was harm to people, or there was some kind of issue that occurred that was not detailed in the safety plan and didn't have some kind of plan to manage that risk, then not only could the business be held accountable for that, but the individual developer could be held accountable for that. So I think that this is a reason for everybody to be really aware of what's happening, even if it's just in their own state, about these major bills that are coming up for vote. Because if you're a junior UX designer and somebody says to you, welcome to your first job, here's an assignment for you to do, and you just do the basic assignment, but then that assignment ends up being part of some kind of, resulting harm down the road, could you be held responsible for that as an individual designer that's working for a company that has given you an assignment? And I think that that's something that we need to be taking a look at. So it's really good to have an understanding of kind of what's happening. But that's like the biggest sticking point, I would say, in terms of this bill in the state of California, is that people are really worried that it will have kind of a chilling effect on individuals who are building these models, and then a chilling effect on even small companies. Like, imagine working for a small company, not just somebody who's building out the actual model on the back end, but then people who are building all of those front end features in that interface. They may not be able to put into place all of these safety features and safety plans that are required by the state of California if this passes, meaning that these large companies, the Googles and the Microsofts, et cetera, are able to keep doing what they do, whereas small companies would be at risk of going under, smaller AI companies, because they would struggle to be able to implement all of the necessary sort of safety requirements off the top.
Yeah, that's a really great observation, because, like you're saying, depending on how rigorous that safety requirements documentation needs to be, right, or how robust that documentation needs to be, if it's just, this sort of stamp of approval or a validation, like, we swear it's safe, right, versus we forecasted all of these potential risks, and this is how likely or unlikely those risks are, then that's obviously going to be a very different type of document, or a very different process, I guess, ultimately. Because it's one thing to create a document that's simply for, because the regulation said so, simply for compliance reasons, versus creating the document with a good intention of actually trying to avoid harm. So it does certainly seem like having the regulation is certainly better than not having any regulation at all around, around the safety and harm reduction measures, but I can certainly see the risk. And actually, this is something that we talk about a lot. So I recently wrote an article about design risks, and how do you create a risk assessment matrix to forecast potential risk as well as mitigate some of these potential risks. And actually, it's something I adapted from the U.S. Army, their deliberate risk assessment matrix. You could certainly apply that to different design risks. Like, okay, this design has the potential to be misused, or this design has the potential to result in unintended consequences that may ultimately harm somebody. So I do think it's really helpful as a way to kind of future-proof especially a particularly innovative or new technology that hasn't been tested. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there, in case there were some folks already thinking about their own risk assessments. And Paige, if you have any thoughts on that process, I would love your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think that this is a great example of where people can feel empowered to create frameworks that help to spur conversation. So the framework that you've just shared, somebody could adopt that and use that in a conversation, but they could use it as a starting point. So I think that anybody in the history of the world who has created a framework, I feel like there would be very few people who have created a framework or a matrix of some kind who would say, this is the end all be all. This captures every single piece of this. It's just not in the nature, I think, of a researcher and the people who would create frameworks to say, this is perfect, like no notes. So I think it can be used as a starting place. And this is an area where I find in the world of responsible AI where people get a little bit tripped up, is that they think that if they're handed a framework, in any part of the responsible AI conversation, that working through that framework is enough to tell them whether what they're putting out is safe or not safe or where the risks are. And I don't think that is true. It's really meant to be a starting place because there's no one framework that could encompass all of the different risks and all of the different perspectives from all of the different companies for all of the different jobs for all of the different use cases. It's not out there. So it's good to think of it as, a starting point and a really helpful starting point, and then being willing to have a dialogue that moves beyond, maybe what's been created and builds on these frameworks that we have.
Could not agree more, honestly. And especially thinking about the way like the deliberate risk assessment tool is used in the Army even, right? The idea is, hey, we have a mission. We're going to just think about some of the most likely or most catastrophic like risks and just put those out on the table so that we can try to mitigate the worst that could possibly happen. But naturally, you can't what if everything. Like there's always going to be random risks. Like what if an asteroid hits Earth? Like, okay, can it happen? Yes. Will it happen? Maybe, but it's very low likelihood. And even if it did, how much control do we have of that? So like, obviously there's a point at which you get diminishing returns, what ifing everything. And you do need to move forward at some point with some sort of design resolution. But of course, like you're saying, it's meant there to be a starting point. It's meant to serve as a conversation tool, a conversation starter, and also as something that gets revisited occasionally, especially as a technology changes or as policy changes. Like you're saying, it may be slow, but it does eventually change as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, especially the part about revisiting, because another thing that I see when people have conversations about responsible AI, whether it's just in their own role, there are companies that are not implementing responsible AI, so individuals are taking that on and saying, I'm going to have some responsible AI principles that I work to adhere to, which I think is really great. But for businesses that are implementing anything related to responsible AI policy, it's never a one and done situation. It's never like you go and you do the framework or you do the analysis and then it's like, we've done it. Everything is responsible. I have these conversations regularly and I ask, what are your plans for like a governance operation? Like for actually coming through and re-reviewing these things on a regular basis, bringing in new voices, bringing in expertise, asking bigger questions, evaluating what's happening in the market, evaluating what's happening in the lives of people who are using your technology. And so I think that governance piece coming back and re-reviewing is a really important part of this as well.
Definitely. And it's funny, the word governance is something that scared me as a junior designer. I remember the first time I heard it, I'm like, governance, is that something I do? I was like, that is something, is that my job? Is that someone more important than, or like someone who's more senior than me? Is that their job? And then I realized governance, like as a term, really is more about thinking of our own internal policies, and it can be a company's policies, it can be a team's policies, but governance ultimately has to do with us deciding how we want to operate and how we want to allow others to operate, who has authority and who doesn't. And to some extent, junior designers may not have total control over that, but they do have the ability to ask questions about who's responsible for this and how do we ensure that the people who have control over the design of AI or a design of a tool ultimately know the policies themselves, right? And there are things we can do to create a design or create a tool that gets used responsibly because the educational materials are out there, or because the policies are well communicated, or because the design itself is ultimately helping people to use the tool responsibly. Yeah. And I think there is a lot that designers can do with that in mind, right? There's content writing that we can consider. There's messaging that we can consider. And this is very much like a multidisciplinary act. It's not something where it's just like there is one designer, especially as you talked about like this, the safety requirements, publishing that documentation, and then the risk that, there is a single developer who could be on the hook if things aren't done correctly, or a team could be on the hook if this isn't done correctly. Now, if we're doing things right, if we have healthy team dynamics, if we have really good communication in place, then does that change the fact someone could still be on the hook? No, but I think that at least starts the conversation and allows more of the team to take ownership of what could be this outcome that does ultimately make for a better product in the long run. So, but it definitely seems to require communication across departments. Like marketing needs to talk to UX, or that team also needs to talk to content, et cetera.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree with that. And I think, we've talked quite a bit about junior designers. And I think that there's, people who are not so junior designers, who are managing teams, et cetera, who are also in a position to create that collaborative environment, to open up those conversations, and to get everybody to a place. Maybe everybody's not, reciting the same rules of, responsible development and design and creation, but maybe they're all joining the same conversations and having a dialogue about what's happening. Because like I said, a lot of this stuff is being worked out in real time. People are still creating, responsible AI principles and responsible tech principles. Things are still changing. I mean, I feel like the world of security has been like pretty solid for a long time, but things are even shifting there. And especially because AI is now, in the world of technology and policy in a more prominent way, security, the way we think about security has changed. And so things are always shifting and changing. And I think being able to lead a team, whether you're as an individual contributor and you're just bringing people together for like a lunch and learn kind of a chat, or you're a team lead and you're making this like a top priority on your agenda for the quarter to have these conversations, I think there's a lot of ways that we can engage people in the conversation to get them thinking about it in a way that could have long-term positive impacts on the way we build, the way we design, the way we create, the way we implement in the future.
Absolutely. That's such a great takeaway, especially thinking about, some of the more senior folks who are starting to orchestrate some of these, like not only the project timelines or roadmaps, but like you're saying, responsible AI principles and design principles, and ultimately synchronizing all this work in a way that keeps everyone in alignment. So I guess my last question for you will be, if someone wants to learn about how to make good responsible AI principles, do you have any tips for where someone can start to learn about these things, and maybe foster some of this professional development on their own teams?
Yeah, great question. A lot of large companies out there have their own responsible AI principles, and they're very similar across the board. But what you may do is start by taking a look to see what these companies are putting together in terms of responsible AI principles, and then pull that together in one place, and maybe that's the first conversation. How many of these apply to the work that we actually do? Where could we see that fairness comes into play in the way we design a button, or the flow that a customer goes through from X to, Y? And so, bringing all of those into one place, you can get a lot of that just from those larger companies. But there's smaller companies as well. There's also the Responsible AI Institute. If your business is looking to really deeply invest in what responsible AI looks like, the Responsible AI Institute is excellent. It's a not-for-profit organization, and they partner with a lot of companies. I think most recently, one of the companies they partnered with was like Booz Allen Hamilton, to help them ensure that they are focusing on responsible AI. So that's pretty significant. So that's a good organization. You can also, I think, once you get a foundation of what some of the responsible AI principles are that people are considering, you could shift and tweak those for your organization. But I think that you'll find that a lot of them fall under the same categories: trust, safety, transparency, fairness, accessibility. And a lot of those things are, so broad that they can be applied in specific ways to different types of work. So.
Definitely. And I think the key takeaway here is, like, as much as I love a lot of like you were saying, frameworks can be a great starting point, but where I see, especially in the realm of AI, where things are developing rapidly, it's often tempting to kind of take a template and just use the template. And certainly that's probably better than nothing. But like you're saying, there's going to be really unique and really more relevant ways of applying some of these principles that a template simply won't get at. And that's where I think these are going to be a really great conversation starter. But definitely that Responsible AI Institute sounds like a great starting point, and also great for people who just want to learn more in general. So on that note too, you not only have your Substack, but I remember being so excited when I learned that you also have a TikTok where you do some more of these breakdowns. And so if reading's not your cup of tea, what's the TikTok that I can point people to, or any other social media that you might like to point people to?
Yeah, I do have a TikTok. It's called AI Ethics with Paige. And I do a lot of coverage on a lot of different topics. Lately, it's been more than I would like about politics, but definitely I'm covering a variety of other things as well. And then starting in September, I am launching a podcast called Just AI, and it's about the intersection of artificial intelligence, policy, ethics, and just justice in general, just AI. And the goal is to interview people who are kind of here in this critical moment where we're having conversations about what does it look like to build artificial intelligence and deploy it responsibly into the world so that we can prioritize human flourishing instead of prioritizing things like profit. So yeah, that podcast is coming out, and I'll be, engaging with people who are parts of this responsible AI conversation from so many different angles because it cuts across so many fields. So yeah, I'm excited about that.
I'm so excited about that, Paige. I'll be one of your first listeners for sure. And Paige, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time out of your day. I know you're working on tons and tons of projects to do your job at GitHub on top of all of your regular publishing of AI policy content and researching and staying up to date on all that stuff. I know it's not easy, but I know our audience really appreciates it. I certainly appreciate it. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Paige Lord. You can find links to her Substack and TikTok in the show notes. Also, at our website, we have loads of articles and videos about UX of AI products, as well as how you might use AI to optimize UX work itself, a topic we just so happen to cover in our next regular episode. So stay tuned for that. All of those things can be found at www.nngroup.com. Finally, if you like this show, please leave a rating and hit subscribe or follow on your preferred podcast platform. This episode was hosted by me, Therese Fessenden, and produced by Chrissy Richardson. Thanks for listening. Until next time, remember, keep it simple.